on Paranthropology. As you will see, I'm sitting higher than the rest because Mick decided, as I was the chair, that I should sit up on the throne. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to chair this session. It was inspired by Jack Hunter here on my left, who did his PhD as an anthropologist looking at Mediumistic Circle in Bristol, and he then founded the online journal of Paranthropology, which is where the name comes from, and there are now several books out that he has edited that have come out from that journal. So the inspiration is all Jack's. And in our panel discussion, we will start with Jack. Now, I suggested to the panel that we do our presentations without PowerPoint, because we are really quite tight on time, and this way we can actually make it more of a discussion between the panel. So each member of the panel is going to have 10 minutes to do their presentation, and Stan has asked me to be absolutely rigorous in the timing, so I've got a timer with me. After the 10-minute presentation, there will then be 5 minutes for discussion between the members of the panel only. After the final presentation, we will then open it out to you, the audience, for your contributions, discussions, questions and so on, which you can address either to the whole panel or to particular members of the panel, and Mick is going to have a couple of mics to run around with in his normal, wonderful manner. So that's the idea of what we're doing. Whether we stick to it or not remains to be seen. But let me first of all ask Jack if he could start with his presentation.
Sure. Is this working? Can everyone hear me? Okay. So what I'm going to do now is really very quickly just give a brief overview of the history of this, call it an emerging field, but actually its roots go right back to the very foundations of anthropology as a discipline. And there are a few kind of much more comprehensive overviews than this. Paul Devereaux's got a good overview, David Luke's written a good overview, Mark Schroll's written a good overview, so there's a few that you can check out, and I've written a couple as well. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly go through all these main key characters. So first of all, we're going to go right back to the very, very beginning of anthropology and look at three guys. E.B. Tyler, who's widely regarded as the kind of founding father of anthropology, James Fraser and Andrew Lang. So all of these guys, as well as being the first anthropologists, can also be thought of as the first paranthropologists, because they were interested in supernatural beliefs, they were interested in religion, and kind of trying to find out where these ideas came from. And they all came at it from slightly different perspectives. So Tyler came up with this idea of animism, which is his label for the belief in spirits in general, and he identified this as the very foundation of religion. So for Tyler, all religion basically boils down to belief in spirits. And he said that this arises from our kind of, he called it primitive philosophizing. So we're making sense of the world around us from the things that we see from sleep and dreams, but ultimately our primitive interpretations were incorrect. Which is an interesting conclusion to come to because Tyler himself actually had some strange experiences with mediums in the 19th century. We're going to have time to talk about that. And then there's James Fraser, who is a cultural evolutionist, basically. And his ideas were that magical belief was like the most primitive form of scientific thinking. So he had this scheme from magic to religion and then to science. And like Tyler, Fraser was of the opinion that all magical beliefs, all supernatural beliefs were ultimately false, incorrect, already being superseded by scientific rationalism. And then, as a counterpoint to these guys, we've got Andrew Lang, he's really the kind of founding father of anthropology, in my opinion. And he called for what he called comparative psychical research, which is a merging of parapsychology and anthropology in a good way. And he suggested that supernatural beliefs might have their origins in kind of genuinely strange experiences, regardless of whether those experiences turn out to be genuinely paranormal or not. So in a way, this is kind of like a predecessor of David Hufford's more recent experiential source hypothesis. So they're the kind of early pioneers. And then by the beginnings of the 20th century, anthropology had started to diversify, and anthropologists began to go out into the field to actually experience these cultures that they'd only really written about in their libraries. Their accounts had previously been based on missionary reports, the explorers' reports, with their biases. So we've got guys like Franz Boas in America and Bronislaw Malinowski, who's a Polish-British anthropologist. And their whole thing was basically that you had to get involved. You've got to experience the culture from the inside as far as possibly can. And with this, we begin to see anthropologists actually having strange experiences themselves. Most notably, in my opinion, Evans Pritchard, who's, as far as anthropologists go, is a pretty big anthropologist. And he worked with the Azandi, and when he was with the Azandi, he had this experience of seeing this like a ball of light one evening flying towards this guy's hut, and he noticed this thing, and then when he told his informants about it, they said, oh, that was witchcraft substance. That was witchcraft on its way to attack someone. And sure enough, the next day they found that someone had actually died. But Evans Pritchard, he wasn't, he appreciated the significance of witchcraft, and he understood that it wasn't necessarily irrational, that it could be reconciled with a rational kind of scientific view of the world. But at the same time, he didn't want to fully embrace it, and he explained away this light as a torch lit by someone on his way to go to the toilet in the night. It's a bit of a strange one. And ultimately, he came up with this idea of ontological bracketing, what I call ontological bracketing, which is the idea that you don't have to question the reality or not of these beliefs. What you've got to do is just study the social implications of them, which is basically the standard default position of anthropology today. And I'm going to move, we heard a little bit earlier about Ernesto Di Martino. His work was in the 1940s and 50s, but it only really published in English in the 1960s. But his work with Tarantella dancers in Italy was particularly interesting, and he drew in all of these parapsychological threads as well. So in a way, he was like the first guy to bring parapsychology specifically and anthropology together. And he's not very widely known amongst English-speaking scholars in this field, but I think it's pretty cool. And he came up with this idea, which I think is probably his biggest contribution to this field, that parapsychology experiments generally seem to ignore the wider kind of social and cultural components that feed into the experience, and specifically the emotional and psychological factors that are involved as well. So he spoke of the drama of the real-life experience and how this is reduced in parapsychology. So what he suggests is that the ethnographic method is particularly well suited to studying the conditions and the preconditions and the processes that ultimately give rise to these experiences, and suggests that parapsychologists could take a lot from this kind of ethnographic approach. Okay, we're in the 1960s now. So about 1968, Carlos Castaneda publishes his controversial books, where he recounts his strange experiences with a Yaqui sorcerer called Don Juan. There was a lot of debate following the publication of these books as to whether they were like genuine accounts of real experiences or whether he just made the whole thing up. But for me, the most important thing about these books is that they paved the way for a new kind of ethnographic writing, which I think has relevance to everything that we're talking about here. And that approach is a kind of experientially grounded ethnographic writing that incorporates the experiences not only of our informants but also our own subjective experiences. So in a way, it doesn't really matter whether what he was writing was true or not. The kind of direction he's pointing us in is a fruitful direction. The 1960s also saw Margaret Mead pushing for the incorporation of the Parapsychological Association into the American Academy of Sciences. So we can see here there's kind of, again, this interaction between the two disciplines. And Margaret Mead herself was interested in the psychosocial makeup of what she called psychic sensitives. And then, really, it all starts to kick off in a kind of subdued way. In the 1970s, there was 2 conferences specifically looking at the links between anthropology and parapsychology. And they published a couple of books. One was published by the Parapsychology Foundation, called Proceedings of an International Conference on Anthropology and Parapsychology. And the other one was published by Joseph K. Long. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head now, but it's a good book. And these are the roots of what would eventually emerge as the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness in the 80s. In the 70s and 80s, we also see anthropologists in the field beginning to open up about their own strange experiences. So we've got 3 good examples. One was Bruce Grindle, who saw a corpse reanimated in a divination ceremony. John Favre Sada, who became embroiled in these witchcraft beliefs in rural France. And then Paul Stoller's apprenticeship to a Songhay sorcerer, and he got cursed and attacked and all that stuff. But the important thing is that they incorporated all of this into their ethnographies and produced this kind of richer, deeper understanding of what's actually going in these alternate ontologies or alternate reality types. The 70s and 80s also saw the crystallization of transpersonal anthropology and Charles Laughlin's work, biogenetic structuralism, and Michael Winkelmann suggested that magical practices might actually have their foundations or their roots in genuine psi experiences. Then we've got Patrick Giesler's work and his psi and process methodology, which is very good, and Serena's work also fits into that category. Getting close to the end. In the 90s, Edith Turner, who was a massive big influence on me, and she was at a conference that me and Stan attended at Essendon a couple of years ago. It was amazing. She emphasized the importance of immersion and participation in rituals in order to understand the experiential foundations of ritual. And she saw this spirit extracted from the back of an afflicted patient. Then we have, moving into the late 90s, 2000s, Geomagnetic published a book called Being Changed by Cross-Cultural Encounters. And it's all about engaging with the extraordinary experiences, not only of fieldwork informants, but also of the anthropologists themselves. And then we've got Fiona Bowie, my supervisor, and me. Yeah. That's it.
Jack, thank you very much. I'm now actually going to take a chair's prerogative on this little bit of our panel discussion, because Jack has given us a very beautiful presentation of the history from the anthropological perspective, looking at psychic phenomena. So as he mentioned, Stanley here has been involved for many, many, many decades, all from the parapsychological perspective. And so I'm actually going to ask him if he could give us a few words on the history of parapsychological anthropology.
Thank you, and it will be just a few words. This was a breathtaking panorama that you got from Jack. Marvelous. A few years ago, I wrote an article for Society for Psychical Research on this topic, and I divided the investigations into uncontrolled observations, controlled observations, pilot experimental studies, and formal experimental studies. The first uncontrolled observation that I'm aware of was actually done by my anthropology professor, William McGovern, and recorded in his book, Jungle Paths and Inca Ruins. He was in South America taking what is today known as ayahuasca with a tribe, and the shaman of the tribe had a vision of what was happening 300 miles distant in another tribe. A chief had died suddenly, and they were having an elaborate ritual to send his soul to the other world. McGovern actually traveled those 300 miles, found the tribe, and everything that the shaman had envisioned was absolutely accurate. Now, let's skip forward. Many of you know about the work among the Australian Aborigines by Rose and Rose. And this was what I'd call a pilot study. They used the standard ESP cards and found that the highest scoring people were the wise men and the wise women, who we would probably call shamans. This was published, it was not followed up, but it's landmark in the field. Now here's a controlled observation done a bit later by Loubser of South Africa. He hid several objects in a village and had a shaman try to find them. The shaman was successful, that's the good news. The bad news is that Loubser was with the shaman, and as you know, people can watch certain clues and can figure out where something is hidden by glances, by gestures, by nonverbal communication. Nevertheless, that's an important hallmark in the parapsychological investigations. Now, in terms of formal experimental studies, we have the work of Paranthropology, which some of you know. Very innovative, using the images of the Orishas of Brazil with the African-Brazilian religion, shamanic mediums, and he did get significant results. That's the good news. The bad news is the ordinary members of the tribe did just about as well as the mediums did. But still, this stands today, I think, as probably the best paranthropological document of the history. My own work you'll hear about a little bit later, but that gives you a quick overview of parapsychology and parapsychological methods in paranthropology.
Title of the last.
Thank you very much, Stanley. And Stanley's taken us very nicely on, because when we discovered that Patrick was actually here at the PA, there was no way we could hold this discussion panel without a little bit of input from Patrick. So you have a couple of minutes before our next speaker.
All right, I'll give you it all in 2 or 3 minutes if I can. Yes, ma'am. You can hear me?
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Yes, well, thank you very much, Stan, and thank you very much, Jack, whom I've just met and am very honored to meet. I'm so happy with the work that he's doing, and with David, and of course, Serena. And Stan has been doing this before I did. He won't admit it, but we all know that. Back in 1982, at the combined SBR and PA, the first one that I attended, same as this, it was in Cambridge, and that's where I presented this paper on parapsychological anthropology, which I proposed would be a multi-method approach to the study of psi in the field setting. The idea was to try to get at native practices, beliefs, rituals that at least they claim or that appear to be by explorers or early anthropologists that Jack reviewed as having something we would call paranormal going on, but to not interfere at all. Leave it exactly as they say it happens, but somehow tap into it and measure it, a controlled observation, exactly as Stan said, however, without interfering. In social psych, it's called unobtrusive measures. You may want to study racial tensions in a community, and so you go to a supermarket. Supermarket's already there. People are already going in and out of the 2 doors in the front. But you might place a black person standing there looking at his cell phone in front of one door, and a white person in front of the other door. And you would measure how many people tend to go to the white side if they're white, or the black side if they're black, or what. And then you switch the doors, and you do control by just watching them go in and out without anybody at the doors. And this way you're not interfering at all with the event of going to the supermarket, but you're able to get some understanding of what's going on. So I applied that inside the process. And overall, in my looking at the history like Jack did, I realized there was just incredible claims out there. And in my own experiences in Brazil, where I did all my field work for 20 years, it's just everywhere. It's every creek and every crack and corner we find psychic claims of one kind or another. So I thought that modeled after psychological anthropology, we could develop a parapsychological anthropology where we would do ethnographic studies, and those would be very much like what Stan called the uncontrollable. Then we'd learn about the curses in detail. We wouldn't just learn about the beliefs and practices of religion, but specifically those that pertain to parapsychological stuff as well. So an ethnography that is more focused on those kinds of questions would be one angle to go at. And then the second one would be to bring in parapsychological attempts, and studies and the controlled observations, and ones that I did as well. Test the mediums with remote viewing or with some kind of culturally sensitive targets, as Stan was mentioning that I did. So I would call that more cross-cultural parapsychology, like cross-cultural psychology. It's universalistic. We have a model, here's a test, you do it, we'll make comparisons, we'll do our thing over there, but we'll try to make it culturally adjusted and adapted. Now those are the two standard approaches, and Ronald Rose and Bob Van de Castle and Mike Winkleman and Stan, of course, and I were doing these kinds of tests in different kinds of ways, trying to make them culturally sensitive and so on. But the third way is the way that I proposed, and that's signing process. So I looked at divination in various kinds of, this is allowing you to do something like experimental, get the statistics, but not interfere with the ritual, not interfere with their process. This is how they say it works. Can we observe it without interfering? And so I did a study where I compared divination across 3 different kinds of African Brazilian-derived religious practices. And I managed to get clients who normally were going to go there anyway, and they had lost objects, but we knew and we could determine where these were, kind of like Lautcher did, and it took me a little bit more time to explain it. But in the end, we were able to obtain through independent judges how good these and how comparatively good these diviners were. So that would be myself, these 3 approaches. It's very much like what Stan had said. A ethnographic approach to get psi-related events, a cross-cultural parapsychology event where we can do various kinds of experiments like we do here, but in a different cultural context, and then signing process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will have more time at the end for a little bit more in detail about what both Stan, Jack and Patrick have given very, very briefly here at the beginning. But I'd like to move us on now to David Luke's work, which is the second type of process that Patrick has just outlined, what he would call more cross-cultural parapsychology. So David, please now you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. So my brief talk is really about what happens if you don't listen to Patrick and go ahead and do this kind of research from a parapsychological perspective without having the insights of Patrick's fantastic research. So I'm based here at Greenwich, and given that it's somewhat of a shabby location, I do like to get out and do some field research now and then. And I do a lot of research on psychedelics. I should probably clarify that. I do psychedelic research. My interest in that is because of what it can tell us about the possible neurobiology of psi experiences and the exceptional experiences. And also because people report a high degree of psi experiences under the influence of psychedelics, maybe as high as 80% based on some surveys. So it's certainly something interesting to study. Also, it becomes quite difficult to do this kind of research here in the West with people because of the legal situation, although that's becoming more possible now. We do have some research starting. But it struck me that the best way to do this kind of work is to go out to the field and go to places where these things are used traditionally in the shamanic context and kind of with legal backing as well, and auspices of that. So also people in these shamanic cultures who use these psychoactive plants also claim a lot of psychic experiences as well. So I attempted to do some field research. I started off initially by going out to Brazil, based on what Stanley had said about the reports of the use of ayahuasca in particular for people having kind of psychic experiences. So much so that some of the earliest researchers of ayahuasca, a chemist by the name of Cardina Fisher, isolated one of the active principles of ayahuasca and named it telepathy, thinking because of the high degree of kind of subjective experiences of telepathy or clairvoyance. So I devised this experiment, which was based on my PhD research, which was a kind of very laboratory-based task, and I kind of adapted it very slightly, but what I thought was a kind of suitable method for testing people under the influence of ayahuasca. It was basically a forced choice design where people would look at a number of fractal images, which was supposedly kind of somewhat related to kind of visual mental imagery people would get under the influence of ayahuasca, and they would try and visualize which one of the four images was the target, the so-called precognitive target yet to come. So there was a number of kind of methodological issues which came out of that, in fact, in how to actually run this experiment in the middle of an ayahuasca ceremony. First of all, I was going to find people to give me permission, and the Santa Clara Church and other organisations in Brazil were very helpful. In fact, they were very encouraging. They wanted to see some science involved in what they do. So they permitted me to do these experiments. But only once people had come out of the ceremony, so they didn't want it to intrude. So here we have a kind of ethnographic gap already, which needs to be bridged. And also that I had to take part, which kind of added a whole new level of difficulty to the situation. But I did manage to collect some data over a period of a few years, and unfortunately the results weren't very good, and that's probably because of my methodology. For one thing, it's compromised by going into these ceremonies and getting people to do something which is kind of very much alien to what their intentions are of being in the ceremony. And the other thing is, as Mario pointed out at one point, that my actual experiment wasn't really suited to this because the images I was using were very homogeneous. So I redesigned the experiment. I borrowed more from Gansfeld and Dream Research. Used free response imagery, 1-minute video clips, and I went back to South America, this time to Ecuador. And I hadn't had a particularly good time myself with the ayahuasca, so I switched to what I thought might be a more suitable substance, which was mescaline, which was derived from San Pedro cactus. So I got to Ecuador, I had some tips, and I went on a wild shaman chase, really, over the Andes, kind of back and forth, calling up these kind of shamans. Shamans and telephones are not a good mix, they're very hard to get hold of. They operate at a different level, but after running around the Andes several times, I managed to kind of get a curandero who'd let me do my experiments in his ceremony. He said, "Oh yes, great, you can do ESP experiments, this sounds fantastic." So we're all set up to go, we prepared the ceremony, and I pull out my computer, and he was like, what are you doing? So yeah, well, I'm doing the test on the laptop itself, and he was like, oh, like this. And so it's okay, I've got plenty of batteries, because I didn't have any electricity there. And so he just kind of led me to the edge of the mountain, and he kind of pulled out an enormous conch shell and he turned me around and kind of blew this conch at my backside up. And then he turned me around to the four directions. And that was his kind of answer. He basically explained, this is the place of my ancestors, we come here and this is what we do, it's very sacred. And you can't bring your computer into the ceremony. Okay, so this is when I realised that perhaps I should look at the anthropological literature, and doing that I come across Patrick's excellent work, and he proposed that we need a very much a multi-method approach where you inform your parapsychological field experiments with ethnography. You spend some time living with the culture and you begin to understand them, and also then you apply what they say about their extraordinary phenomena to your experimental paradigm, not back to front, that you don't take your experimental paradigm and try to apply it to the local culture. For instance, why would people expect to have this rather abstract precognitive performance in an ayahuasca under the influence of ayahuasca, or a mescaline for that matter? I will point out, however, I did do the mescaline experiment on, I had one participant who could do it. I was going to have 20 people and test them all to do one trial each. Because I wasn't allowed to do it in the ceremony, I just did it on myself, and got very good results actually, 20 trials. So I had a paradigm which works, for me at least, but maybe not for people in shamanic ceremonies. So taking Patrick's advice, taking more of an ethnographic approach to it, and also trying to develop a silent process approach, I've been spending a lot of time the last 3 years working with Radica, who are better known as the Huichols. They're a community in northern Mexico, pre-Hispanic community. They've been using the peyote cactus in a magical religious practice for, we suspect, several thousand years. And my time working with them has been quite insightful. So I'm kind of working with them and looking to see the kind of things that they say and do, which would suggest some kind of parapsychological phenomena. Now, the big problem here and the challenge is how do we then convert that into some kind of testable experiments? So far, I think they've demonstrated some amount of apparent precognitive dreaming, and we have some formulas for testing that. But some of the most interesting phenomena, we met up with a group of these radical shamans just outside the town. We arranged to meet them, and we all got out of our vehicles out what's going on. Meanwhile, there's enormous dust devil gets up in the field behind them. Maybe like a small tornado. I've never seen one this big though. It's possibly 150 meters high, about 30 meters across, and it sucked up all the maize leaves, all the loose maize leaves in the field, and was kind of moving straight towards us in a straight line direction. And they seem to be completely unaware of it. They just carry on arguing. We're facing them and facing the dust devil, and it's getting closer and closer. And I'm thinking, okay, it's coming straight for us. So when it's nearly upon us, I say, hey, you guys, look behind you. And they kind of look behind, and not too concerned. So one of the jumps just goes like this, and the other one goes like that, and it seems to deflect in the direction in which they're kind of shoving it, and it kind of just goes around us in a big arc, and it carries on going behind us in a straight line. This initial trajectory, which is I was quite impressed, as was everybody else. So they were completely unimpressed. They were back to arguing. Anyway, so now how do we kind of fit that into an experimental paradigm? So that's my question to the panel.
And now we have 5 minutes for members of the panel to have a discussion around everything that we've said so far. David's presentation, Jack's, what's that?
Well, I'll be happy to devote my time to what I learned, what I didn't learn from my anthropology professors. One thing I learned is that when you go into another culture, you spend 3 months listening and watching before you ask questions. And as a result, I've met and visited over 100 shamans around the world, but I only write authoritatively about the African and Brazilian traditions and my work with Rolling Thunder, the Native American medicine man. 2 books about Rolling Thunder, numerous articles about the African Brazilian traditions. What I rejected early in my days when I was studying anthropology at William Howell, University of Wisconsin, you take a dispassionate point of view, you don't make judgments. That's good up to a point, but there are certain cases where I draw the line, too many to go into today. But as an example, in Brazil, I have had many visits in the temple of Pai Eli, who is both a Candomblé and an Umbanda, Pai de Santo, and he has discontinued animal sacrifices. He says the gods don't need all this blood anymore. They've grown, they've matured. So I have given him a lot of publicity, and I've given that advance, from my point of view. In practice, a lot of publicity. I've had him invited to 2 international conferences. He is just in awe. He said, I was nothing before I met you, and now I'm famous. I have visitors from all over the world. I say, fine, tell them that you do not use animal sacrifices. And so this is one case where I've been very much of an interventionist. Other cases too, which we don't have time to go into right now. Now, in terms of my strictly anthropological work, I've done a survey of African Brazilian mediums, mainly Candomblé and Umbanda, and always with a translator. My Portuguese isn't as good as Patrick's, so I always rely upon a translator. And we have questionnaires, we've got data nobody has collected before, absorption scale, dissociation scale scores, even the Kinsey scale. The first time the shamanic mediums of Brazil have revealed their...
Good luck. The thing is exactly as Stan said, exactly as Howell told him in his early anthropology classes. William Howell, right? You're your anthropology professor? And it was Howell, right? Huh?
Yeah.
No, it was Howell.
My first professor that I mentioned was McGovern at Northwestern University. In Wisconsin, it was Howell.
Yeah, yeah. Just as he would tell you, you need to spend that time to really get a sense of what they're saying, what they're claiming, and that's exactly what David is intending to do, and would have to go back and do. So you're trying to get that sabbatical somehow. Yeah, but once he has more ethnographic in, then I think he'll be able
what will be a culturally relevant or intelligible, format. But I think you're on your way. You got to get those arms up, though.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Okay, now, unfortunately, as chair, I'm also a presenter, so I'm going to ask David here, please, can you take the timer, start the timer, and give me my timings in accordance. As many of you might know, I spent 6 years working in India. I was initially invited by a yoga university in an ashram to teach parapsychology to yoga psychology students. And as they were postgraduate students, I was giving them little research projects. And one of the research projects I got so interested in, I asked the guru of the ashram if I could actually do it as research in the ashram, not just with the students, but with what are called the swamis, who are the yogic monks and nuns, many of whom had done 30 or 40 years of meditation. And so we were doing parapsychology, but within the yogic culture. And what Patrick and David have both emphasized is the importance of spending time getting to know the culture and the people who you are working with. So I had my whole of my first year in the ashram, where I was working with the students, getting to know the culture of the ashram, getting to know the culture of the swamis. And then my second year was when we started the research, and we essentially spent 2 years getting the methodology right. Getting the methodology to be something that they all felt really comfortable doing. And I think this is so important. We were doing essentially free response parapsychological method design. There was somebody called Jez Fox who very kindly created the computer program for me so that we could get it all running on the laptop, and the laptop was my laboratory on my back, which I could take anywhere to anyone within their chosen situation. And this felt incredibly important in enabling everyone to feel comfortable. And so they would come into my room in the ashram, they would sit down on the floor because all the yogis do their meditation sitting on the floor. We'd have the candle, we'd have the incense. They asked to have a few minutes just for relaxation. Many of them were coming from very difficult jobs that they had to do within the ashram. Then they would do their meditation. Then they would do what in yogic is called Chiddakashdharana, which is where you look into the space behind the closed eyes. And their instructions then were to try to see the video clip that they would be getting at the very end of the session. So they would look into Chiddakashdharana, they would get their impressions, then they would come out from that, they would draw down whatever they'd seen just in any other remote viewing or Ganzfeld type methodology. They would describe their experiences to me, they'd see the 4 video clips and they'd choose the one that's closest to their experience. This was what they were happy with. Now, for various reasons, I only did those 2 years in the ashram, and then I moved on to working with the Tibetans. And once again, this thing of getting to know the culture came to the fore, because the Geshe, a Geshe is like a PhD in Buddhist psychology, who was the principal of the institute that I was working under, he insisted that I spend the whole of my first year studying Buddhist philosophy, the Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. I went to teachings by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, where I found my interpreter because I didn't speak Tibetan, so I needed a translator. He then took me to meet various Rinpoches who were considered to be enlightened beings, who taught me all about Tibetan psychic culture. And for the whole of that first year, even I kept asking, not one Tibetan monk would work with me, not one. But obviously I did something right in that first year. I had no idea what it was, because when I went back for the second year, the principal of the institute said he found a Rinpoche who would work with me, living in a monastery down in South India. And I went down to South India, I got all the permits from the Indian government because it was an area that visitors are not allowed to go to. And then the Rinpoche opened the doors and I was able to do my work. Now, very fortunately, talking about methodology now, the method that we had designed at the ashram worked perfectly for the Tibetans because they have a tradition called Mo divination, where one of the Mo divinations, they will look into a mirror or look into a lake to see a vision to answer that question, such as where is the new Dalai Lama being born? And then they will have a picture of a farmhouse and a picture of a mountain, and they will travel through Tibet to find the right farmhouse and mountain. So it's very like the Ganzfeld, where you have the decoys, but you mustn't get diverted by the wrong farmhouse and mountain. You've got to find the right farmhouse and mountain. So to have, with the Tibetans, we were actually using static pictures of Tibet, that what they were familiar with, an environment they were familiar with. And in the second year, we actually moved to pictures of India and Tibet, because of course they were Tibetans living in India. But they weren't bothered by the fact of the decoy pictures. They were able to go to the actual picture because, of course, that was in their training. Not to get diverted, but to go to the actual one that they were trying to see. And for them, they have this thing when they do Mo divination and they blow on the Marlow or the dice or whatever it is they're using for the divination. Breath, very important. So they used to blow on the computer screen before they got to see the four pictures. You know, that it was part of the ritual, part of the way of doing it. And they adapted working with Western psychic, scientific methods to what they were familiar and they were comfortable with. And I think that this methodology, getting the methodology right, getting the targets right, getting the ecological validity right, is really so very, very, very important when we are working within different cultures. Appropriate methodology. Oh yes, getting the targets right. So our first thing in the ashram, we worked with the classic standard psychology picture set. Not in an ashram. Too much sexuality and too much violence. Don't go down well. So then, when we moved to the videos, we moved to Kathy Dalton's video set, and I had to go through it and remove anything that I thought was too violent or too sexual, and even then, some of these swamis had been living in that monastery, ashram, not outside of it. They had never had television, they didn't listen to radio, they hadn't seen any films. And I had one little clip, it's very famous one of Marilyn Monroe, when she's standing over the New York subway and the gust of air lifts up her skirt. Very famous. That was too sexual for them. We couldn't have that. Another one where there was a fight with some monster, Perseus and whatever it was, Golden Fleece. That was too violent for them. They were living such an isolated, sheltered life that we had to be really, really, really careful, thank you, on choosing targets that were appropriate. And I will give an example now from the Tibetans. As I said, in our second year working with the Tibetans, we chose targets from India, pictures from India, as well as pictures from Tibet. The reason being that when you just have pictures of Tibet, you've got a mountain, you've got a farmhouse, you've got a yak, you've got a Buddha statue, you've got a mountain, you've got, there was very little variation, not enough variation. So we brought in the pictures from India, and one of them was this beautiful picture of a rock pool. And, of course, me being an ignorant Westerner, we all know rock pools. Tibet is in the middle of a continent. Now, this monk who I was working with, he was one of the star monks. He got a 50% direct hit rate. He was like so good. And in his imagery, he had been in one of the valleys in Tibet at the time of spring when it was full of flowers, a flower-filled valley. When he got to see the four pictures, and there was the one of the rock pool, he said, "What's that?" So I explained it was a pool in the sea where the rocks are, and these sea anemones were sort of like flowers. He said, "That's what I was seeing." He'd never seen the sea, he had no idea what a rock pool was, but he was able to translate his valley full of flowers to the rock pool. So getting appropriate ecological target, incredibly important. Appropriate methodology, cultural differences. I will just give one example because I'm running out of time. Working with the students in India always honour their teacher. You do not question the teacher. You do everything that the teacher wants. They knew the hypothesis, which was that as you practice meditation, so over the years, you become more and more psychically aware. That's part of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Thank you very much. They were really good. In the first year, they Simist, in order to make sure that the Swamis did better than them. This is completely unconscious, working according to the hypothesis to give the teacher what she wants. They did a bit better the second year, they only did chants, so that the Swamis again got it. But one has to be really aware of all these little subtle cultural differences that will affect the score. And my wonderful timekeepers told me I'm run out of time, so thank you very much. To have a discussion about anything that has been talked about up until now. Who wants to start off? Back on power. 5 minutes discussion. Anybody want to say anything like that?
We're going to start first, too, right? You got a question? Well, I mean, I'm very, very pleased by your study, of course. Oh, yes, right.
I'm very pleased by Serena's study, of course, because it reveals all the kinds of problems that we're talking about and that David brought up as well in his efforts to try to get the right target, try to understand the culture, and she's been struggling with this for all this time. When she came to the mode divination, oh my gosh, for something that is so comparable to what you want to try to test in the Western way, it fits so that there's so little that they have to shift in order to do that. I mean, it's almost what they do anyway. That's what you're looking for. So in addition to finding culturally, part of this culturally relevant kinds of cross-cultural parapsychology would be not only finding targets that are appropriate on that, but just the whole task, the whole protocol. The more that it can be close to something that they do that maybe you could adapt at your end, that's the best. And I thought that was just brilliant. And then, of course, finding out that Marilyn Monroe is not gonna work, that was very important as well.
Well, I'll make another quick comment in terms of one of the surprise offshoots of this. A few years ago, the World Parliament of Religions was held in Melbourne, Australia. Some of you know about the World Parliament. Anyway, I represented the entire hemisphere of South America because I'm an honorary member of Umbanda and Candomblé. And I talked about those two religions, plus Santo Daime and União de Vegetal, the ayahuasca religions, and Brazilian Spiritism. So here there was this white guy from North America representing all of South America, and I'll be doing it again in Salt Lake City, Utah, this coming October. So I would not be able to talk about this authoritatively if I had not been imbued in this cross-cultural research. So, one reason that I'm very partial to Native American and South American religions, nothing against the Eastern religions, but they do tend to be a little bit sexist, a little bit homophobic. The North and South Americans do not. Women have a great deal of power. It was the women who, when they escaped from slavery, established the African Brazilian religions. The only counterpart you have to this in Europe is really the Wicca tradition. And I'm very partial to the Wicca tradition in North America. Some of my students are Wicca, have written have written dissertations on that. And so, again, I do have litmus tests, and I do have my own partiality, not that I preach to any of these religions, but in terms of what I reinforce one way or another, and try to, shall we say, push things a little bit forward in more progressive directions.
Thank you very much. We still have another minute for anybody in the panel who wants to discuss anything.
I'd just like to reinforce what Stanley says, and that he's a good representative, and he really has done the legwork. He was sort of introducing Stan at a conference last year about shamanism, and he was telling a story about how he'd been to visit this shaman in one continent, and they're going, oh yeah, you must know Stanley Krippner. I said, oh yeah, of course. And he went to see these shamans all in various disparate parts of the world. Like the third time he went to see the shaman, I think in the wildest outback of Siberia or something, and he said, "Oh, hi, I'm from America." Said, "Oh, you must know Stanley Krippner." So he asked me around and after the ethnographic work. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, well, just, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Well, no, I just wanted to reinforce that Stanley is amazing, just absolutely amazing. In parapsychology, my mentor originally was, of course, John Palmer, and still is, when I took the parapsychology master's program with him. And then I met Stanley early on, and has been a great guide for me in everything that I've done. So that these kinds of distinctions he made, I have embellished somewhat, but he has been doing tremendous work all along. And Serena's work is absolutely very exciting too, so I hope you continue.
Well, now, of course, is our chance for Stanley to talk about his work that he's done with Amir Amiden in Brazil. And when Stanley discovered that Patrick was going to be here, he asked, could please his time for presentation be split so that we have a little bit of time for Patrick to talk about his more recent work as well. So this next 10-minute presentation is going to be split between both Stanley and Patrick. Stanley, now is your time.
Actually, thank you, Patrick, for the nice compliment. You've actually done much more work than I have, so I want to allow plenty of time for you to tell the group about the work. My work on your Amiden is summarized in your abstract, but briefly put, I've had 4 sessions with him, and the most extensive session was, and all of this has been published, 6 articles about Amir, it's easy to find. We spent an entire week. He worked as a labor union secretary, and after work he would come over to the offices of Pierre Weil at the Holistic University in Brasilia, and I would have checked every room, including the chapel, to see if there was any prearranged trap or hidden object or artifact. So I and my associates made sure that he had a clean playing field. Then he simply came and sat until the alleged spirits said that something was going to happen. At this point, the physician on our team took his pulse, his blood pressure, and his saliva, because he says he gets a sour taste in his mouth when an apport is about to appear. And we obtained, over that course of the week, some 96 anomalies. We evaluated each of those on a 5-point scale, and that means we threw out half a dozen of them. But the ones that remained, now remember we had numbers here. One of the members of our team was off in the field with the geomagnetic, the only one in the city of Brasilia who had borrowed from a university. And so we had geomagnetic readings. And sure enough, the rougher the geomagnetic readings, the higher there were, the more storms, etc., the more often there were psychokinetic events, psychokinetic apports, etc., at very high levels of significance. Nothing like this has ever been done in the field study before, and it should be. We should look at the ambiance of these events. All you have to do is to have the timing and a simple geomagnetic device. Now, on top of all of that, we looked at the geomagnetic field of the entire South American region, and again we got statistically significant correlates. So, even if Amir had been using sleight of hand, and admittedly he did not have a trained magician on hand, but even if all of this, even things happening in a different room were sleight of hand, how would they have known what the geomagnetic readings were to get the correlations? So this is the challenge I have to people who are, shall we say, skeptical of these very, very dramatic apports. An apport, for those of you who've never heard the term, is an object that seemingly falls out of no place. All of this is in the literature, all of this has been described in great detail in the literature, but I think that it shows how you can take what we've learned in anthropology from field research and what we've learned in psychology from scales and measurements and physiology and psychophysiology, put them together in some package that will teach us a little bit of something. That's my summary.
Thank you very much, Stanley. So that gives us 5 minutes for Patrick.
Well, it's just such an honor that to be on the panel and to hear that everybody's going back to this kind of research, which I'm so thrilled about, and I am as well, in part influenced by others who are continuing, like David and like Jack, and of course always Stanley and Serena, coming back and say, oh, Patrick, you have to get involved. So it really is a booster for me, and I appreciate it very much. Just to say a little bit about what I did in the 80s, and then part of that is tied to what I'm doing now. For each of those 3 areas I talked about, I did a lot of different studies. So I just went over them very briefly. But to give you a sense, from the parapsychological point of view, cross-cultural parapsychology, forced choice, free response, culturally sensitive, try to adapt it to what the particular procedures in a ritual, in a shamanic group, or in a mediumistic, or in a candomblé, or in a nago jeje, or any of these hundreds of these different groups that I had studied. But then for ethnographic research, I went into great detail. I very much enjoyed Leo. Are you here, Leo?
I am.
Yeah. I very much enjoyed your talk on the curses, and did work on curses, and they're just fascinating. I had one of my own experiences, which I'm going to tell you about. It's a great story, but I can't tell you now, you guys. But anyway, it was a really outrageous curse. So something learn about the beliefs of the people. How do they conceive of that? How do they conceptualize that? What can we learn, maybe translate theoretically from how they see it? How do we adapt to their way of seeing it to try to understand it? Translation is really the name of the game, I think, in the end. But one area that mimics psychological anthropology, one of the 6 schools of psychological anthropology that we could transfer over to paranthropology or parapsychological anthropology, would be ethnopsychology, ethnopsychiatry, or ethnoparapsychology, or maybe treating people with different illnesses and ailments in different cultures that may be psychically motivated or influenced. And I think of something like poltergeists. My first date in the village when I was in Peace Corps in Brazil was with this beautiful Brazilian woman, and yet there was a poltergeist going on. And I had never seen one. At least that was what was being claimed. It's a stone shower poltergeist in this village. No electricity, no water. It's dark. The whole village is going to go up the hill to see this poltergeist. And I really wanted to do that, but then again, I wanted to go on the stage. So I said, would you like to go to a poltergeist for a date? And it was the best date of my life, I'm telling you. Mostly because of the poltergeist. Stone shower poltergeist. And later on, this is before parapsychology and all that, when I went back to Brazil and I was doing parapsychological research, very specifically, I went back to the village and I talked to the shamans, that you might call them now, but we would call them really mediums, mediumistic leaders. And one of them was Max Mediano, that I had been an apprentice to. And I said, Max, I got to learn all about that time, all those stones on top of the ceremonial center and the objects moving around, all that stuff that happened. I didn't know what that was. He said, what are you talking about? Well, when the objects started going around by themselves. What are you talking about? Come on, Max. This is like the whole village went up to see your ceremonial center because all these objects are moving around and all that. I don't know what you're talking about. And I thought, oh my God, why is he denying this? The whole village went on, it was big news. But when I finally realized that's not how they conceptualize what a poltergeist is. There's no such thing as objects moving around. There's a spirit called Homouzino. And Homouzino is the one that moves them around. So as soon as I said, when Homouzino was moving around, they told me the whole story in great detail. And I found out by the daughter of this guy, who I was very close to, she said, well, Patrick, we started throwing the rocks as a joke. And we would all gather up, we'd gather up a tremendous number of rocks. And we just threw them because we're really mad at some neighbor that was complaining that we wanted to scare the neighbor away. So we thought the neighbor to the ceremonial center would take off, so we were throwing the rocks. But then we stopped because we got really tired, and it kept showering the stones. They had induced a poltergeist. Bachelor. Kenneth J. Bachelor. This is artifact induction. And it happens all the time in Brazil. And that was one of the first times I'd seen it. I had been familiar with these kinds of dynamics, but until I heard about bachelor, I just didn't know, I didn't have a model. So what I'm doing right now, for example, is I'm studying a West African secret society that the claim is that that they bring back the spirits of the ancestors in a wind, in vento, which you can say in Spanish, Portuguese. And the claim is that they gathered in the jungle at midnight and they put a sacred cloth on the ground. Thanks. Yeah. No levitation in a minute. And then they call back the spirit of this deceased person. It's not a spirit possession. There's plenty of spirit possession, as Stan knows very well, throughout Brazil. But rather, this is calling down a force that supposedly comes underneath the cloth and lifts it up. And that is the rebirth of the spirit of the ancestor. Then years later, certain years, certain times, certain days, all that business, then the spirit of the ancestor is called back in its own kind of cloth and levitates during the ceremonies, ostensibly. It's all secret. It was all hearsay. I heard it from common lay people, but no one ever had gone to it that I ever met. I couldn't get to it, but I finally penetrated it in 1977 to observe this particular kind of ceremony that I was allowed to see. Not this one, but when it's after already it's formed and it does things, it seems to levitate. And then there's also some dematerialization. So what I'm doing right now is, to make a long story short, I started off in 77 with that observation, but I was never able to see the most secret, the most extraordinary levitations that happen in the jungle at midnight, and now I have, and I'm working on it, and I'm writing about it.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Let's show our appreciation for both Stan and